Snow fell heavy on the valley that winter, drifting down in thick sheets that muffled the sound of horse hooves and silenced the village streets by dusk. The land was raw, untamed, and unyielding. The kind of country where a man's grit was measured by how long he could last when the wind turned sharp and the mountains closed in. Folks who lived out there in the late 1800s didn't have the luxury of weakness. Every nail driven into wood, every loaf of bread pulled from a hot oven, every fence mended in the bitter cold, it all carried the weight of survival. In such a place, people clung fiercely to what was theirs. Whether it be land, livestock, or love, but love in those days was rarely simple. It was as hard and jagged as the peaks rising over the timberline, and as unpredictable as a sudden storm. She knew that truth better than anyone, for she had been promised, not by her own heart, but by an arrangement between families. Promised to a cowboy who worked the open range, a man who had charm enough in town and hands skilled with rope and cattle. To the outside world it seemed a fine match, a secure future, a safe choice for a young woman of the village. Yet her heart was restless, stirred by something she could not quite name, something that seemed to come alive only when the wind shifted through the pines at the edge of town. She first saw him there on the fringe of everything, as though the world had pushed him out and he'd chosen not to return. The mountain man. Some whispered about him in the general store when the lamps burned low. They said he had fought off wolves with nothing but a hunting knife. He lived half wild in a cabin so deep in the timber, even the bravest riders never went that far. He came to the village rarely, and when he did, children stopped their games and grown men paused their talk to watch him pass. He carried with him the scent of pine and smoke, his coat heavy with fur, his eyes sharp and unreadable. A man apart, hardened by weather and solitude, no one ever thought he'd cross paths with her. She was meant to stay among her people, in the little church pews and clapboard houses, her life neatly set out before her. Yet fate, or perhaps something greater, is never so tidy. One bitter evening when the snow thickened and the sky fell dark too soon, she found herself far from safety. The storm had turned sudden, and her small mare had stumbled on the frozen trail. She'd wrapped her arms tight around herself, but the cold bit through her shawl and into her bones. When the wind roared louder than her own cries for help, she feared she'd be swallowed whole by the wilderness. That was when he appeared. Out of the curtain of snow, his figure loomed, broad-shouldered and fierce, as though the mountain itself had taken shape and come walking. He lifted her as though she weighed no more than kindling and pressed her close to his chest, his voice deep and steady against the howl of the storm. She clung to him, not only for warmth, but for something she could not understand, a sense of being held by a force she could neither resist nor deny. When she opened her eyes again, it was to the flicker of firelight inside his cabin. The place smelled of pine resin and smoke, walls lined with pelts and shelves carved rough by hand. He moved with quiet ease, laying out food, stoking the flames, wrapping her in a quilt that carried the scent of cedar. The storm raged outside, but inside those four walls she felt a safety she had never known before. Yet with that safety came a dangerous stirring, something she could not name, but which frightened her more than the storm, because she was promised to another. And in that time, a promise was as binding as law. Families depended on such unions. Reputations rested upon them. To break such a bond would mean shame, whispers, and perhaps even ruin. Still, as the hours passed and the fire crackled low, she watched the mountain man's steady hands and the quiet strength in his face. Something inside her shifted like snow loosening on a slope. It's possible to stop once begun. He did not ask her who she was or why she was out in the storm. He did not pry into the life she had left behind in the village. Yet his silence seemed to speak more than words ever could. She found herself wanting to fill it with truths she had never dared utter aloud. She wanted to tell him that her heart had never belonged to the cowboy her family favored, that she had always felt drawn to the wild places, the edges where rules blurred and freedom lived. She wanted to tell him that in one night's shelter, he had shown her more care than she had felt in years of polite company. But she said none of it. Instead, she wrapped the quilt tighter and listened to the storm. trying to ignore the way her heart beat faster when his shadow passed near the furlonge. By morning, the world outside lay buried in white. The trail back to the village was hidden, treacherous, and cold enough to steal a life. He told her she would not be leaving yet, that the mountain would not allow it. His voice was calm, final, the kind of tone a man uses when he knows the land better than anyone. She nodded, though inside she felt the walls closing in. Each hour she remained there, each moment she stole in his presence. She was stepping further away from the life chosen for her. Yet was it truly chosen for her, or forced upon her? That question haunted her as the days stretched on, snow binding the world outside. The mountain man taught her how to split kindling with steady hands, how to brew a pot of coffee over the fire, how to listen for the cries of animals in the woods that signaled danger or prey. With every lesson, her heart betrayed her, clinging not only to the knowledge, but to the man who gave it. She knew she should fear what the village would say, what her family would demand, but fear paled beside the strange certainty she felt when she caught his gaze across the fire. And yet, just as warmth began to creep into her frozen heart, danger stirred outside the cabin walls. For word travels, even through snowstorms. The cowboy who believed she was his would not take kindly to whispers of her rescue, or to the thought of her under another man's roof. And men like him did not let go easily. Out on the plains, where pride and land meant everything, a woman promised was a woman-owned door, so he believed. The mountain, however, held its own laws. And the man who lived by them was not one to bow or bargain. He had taken her in from the storm. Whether he would let her go when the thaw came, that was a question even she did not dare ask. For somewhere deep inside she already knew the answer. Still, the snow had not finished falling. And outside the cabin, shadows moved closer, bringing with them the life she thought she'd left behind. She could feel the weight of it pressing in, waiting for the moment when the peace inside would shatter, and she would be forced to choose between the safe path laid out before her or the dangerous, untamed love of the mountain man who had claimed her heart without a word. And in that moment, as the fire burned low and the storm whispered against the walls, she realized that no matter what choice she made, nothing would ever be the same again. The storm lasted longer than anyone expected. For 3 more days the sky refused to clear, burying the trails beneath drifts higher than a man's waist. The cabin became their world, a single room with a fire at its heart and the sound of wind forever pressing against the walls. She moved through it quietly, learning its small details: the worn handle of the kettle, the stack of wood split with perfect care, the fur pelts laid neatly across the floor. The mountain man lived simply, yet nothing about his life seemed careless. Every tool had its place, every motion of his hands carried purpose. At first, she tried to keep her distance, reminding herself that she belonged to another life waiting down in the village. She thought of the cowboy who had claimed her hand, of the way his voice carried easily in a crowded room, of the way people laughed at his jokes. On paper, he was a good match. He owned cattle, he had family standing, he had the kind of charm people admired. Yet when she remembered him in the quiet hours by the fire, his image felt thin, as though it were drawn in chalk that might wash away with the first rain. Compared to the man across the room, silent and steady as stone, the cowboy's presence seemed to fade. She tried not to let those thoughts linger, but the cabin itself made it difficult. Each day she was forced to see the mountain man in the rhythm of his life. He would rise before dawn to check the traps he had laid, his boots crunching in the snow as he disappeared into the woods. She would wait, listening to the storm, her chest tightening until his figure finally returned with game slung over his shoulder. Then she would watch as he dressed the meat with sure hands, his knife sharp and his movements deliberate. There was a quiet strength in him that unsettled her. He never boasted, never raised his voice. Yet she felt his presence fill every corner of the cabin. Sometimes, when he caught her watching, he would simply nod, as though he understood the thought she could not put into words. That look alone was enough to send her heart stumbling. She told herself it was only gratitude for saving her life, only the natural bond of 2 people forced into shelter together. But deep down she knew there was more. Something had been set in motion the night he carried her from the storm, and no amount of denial could undo it. At night, When the fire burned low and shadows stretched long across the walls, she found herself restless. She would think of the village, of the little church bell that marked each Sunday, of her mother's voice calling her to supper, of the neighbors who whispered in passing. All those familiar things now seemed far away, softened by the distance of snow and mountains. The life she had known felt like a cage she had once accepted without question. Yet here, with the mountain closing in, and the man who lived by its laws sitting silent by the fire, she felt something dangerous, a taste of freedom, of choice, of a future not dictated by others. Still, the weight of her promise hung heavy. In the village, a woman's word bound her as tightly as iron. If she turned her back on the cowboy, it would not only shame her family, but invite anger. Men on the plains valued their pride as much as their land, and pride, once wounded, could drive a man to reckless lengths. She feared what would come when he learned of her rescue. He would not see it as a chance accident of the storm, but as betrayal. The mountain man, however, did not speak of such things. If he sensed the storm brewing beyond the snow, he gave no sign. His focus remained on the present splitting wood, keeping the fire steady, ensuring she had enough to eat. His silence was not cold, but protective, as though he understood that too many words would only make the trap around her heart tighter. She wondered what secrets lay behind that silence. What had driven him to live apart from the village, to carve out a life in the wilderness with no one but himself for company? Folks in town had their stories. Some said he had killed a man in anger. Others claimed he had lost everything to the harsh winters and chosen exile. Yet none of those stories seemed to fit the man she saw before her. His hands bore the scars of labor, not violence. His eyes, though guarded, carried no malice. She began to think that perhaps his solitude was not punishment, but choice. A way to keep himself free from the noise and judgments of the world below. On the fourth morning, the sky began to clear. Blue cracked through the clouds and sunlight spilled across the snow. The mountain looked peaceful, almost gentle in the glow, but she knew better. Beauty in the wilderness was always laced with danger. The trails would remain treacherous, and the cold still sharp enough to claim a life. Yet the thaw meant the village was no longer beyond reach. Soon someone would come looking. Whether it would be her family, worried for her safety, or the cowboy, determined to stake his claim, she did not know. That thought filled her with dread. She pictured the cowboy riding hard through the snow, anger burning in his eyes as he demanded she return. She imagined the whispers in town if word spread that she had spent nights under another man's roof. The shame, the gossip, the harsh judgments of neighbors, it would all come crashing down upon her. She wanted to believe she could face it, that she could explain, but deep down she knew the truth would be twisted no matter how she spoke it. The mountain man seemed to sense her unease. That evening, as the fire burned warm, he looked at her for longer than usual. His eyes lingered, searching, though his lips remained closed. She wanted him to speak, to offer her some answer, some path forward. Yet he gave her none. And perhaps that was his way, letting her find her own strength, rather than pressing his will upon her. She realized then that he was not a man to take what was not freely given. Whatever bond grew between them, it would have to be her choice. But choice was a heavy thing. Heavier than she had ever imagined. The following morning, she woke to the sound of distant hooves. The mountain was quiet, too quiet, except for that faint rhythm carrying through the trees. Her heart lurched. She knew before she even looked at him that the cowboy had come. The mountain man stood at the doorway, his shoulders squared, his hand resting casually near the hunting knife on his belt. He did not move, did not speak, but the air around him grew tense, like the stillness before thunder breaks. She rose slowly, her legs trembling beneath her. For a moment she wished the storm had never ended, that the snow would fall forever and keep the world at bay. But fate does not bow to wishes. The past was riding toward them, and it would not be turned aside so easily. The sound of hooves grew louder, sharper, echoing against the frozen ridges. She pressed her hands against her chest, feeling her heart hammering beneath her palms. Every choice she had avoided, every truth she had buried, now surged to the surface. Soon there would be no hiding, no delay. Soon the life she had known would collide with the life she had only begun to dream of. and the crash would decide everything. The mountain man stepped outside, snow crunching beneath his boots. She followed him to the doorway, gripping the frame as though it could steady her. And there, across the white expanse, she saw the dark figure of a rider cutting toward the cabin. The cowboy had come, just as she feared. His horse's breath steamed in the cold, his posture rigid with determination. She felt her throat tighten, her breath catching in the chill. The mountains seemed to hold its breath as well, the pines standing silent, the air heavy with expectation. The fire behind her crackled, but its warmth could not chase the cold that gripped her heart. And as the rider drew closer, his face becoming clear, she knew that nothing would stop what was about to unfold. The storm outside had ended, but another storm far more dangerous was only beginning. The rider slowed as he neared the cabin, the horse's hooves breaking through the crust of snow with sharp cracks. Steam curled from the animal's nostrils, mixing with the frosty air. While the cowboy sat tall in the saddle, his eyes fixed straight ahead. There was no greeting, no smile, no sign of relief at seeing her safe. His jaw was tight, his expression carved with suspicion. She felt her stomach twist as the truth hit her. He hadn't come to rescue her. He had come to claim her. The mountain man stood steady, his arms crossed over his chest, his frame dark against the pale backdrop of snow. He said nothing, yet his silence was louder than any threat. The two men faced each other across the frozen clearing, one hardened by solitude, the other by pride. She could almost feel the air between them tightening. As though the mountain itself braced for the clash, the cowboy finally broke the silence. His voice carried sharp and cold, slicing through the stillness. "You've been gone long enough. Your family's worried sick, and so's the town. You've got no business being here." Her lips parted, but no words came. Every explanation she had rehearsed in her mind vanished like smoke in the wind. She looked from the cowboy's rigid posture to the mountain man's unflinching stance. And for a moment, she wished she could disappear into the snow. The mountain man shifted slightly, his voice low and steady. The storm would have killed her. She stayed because she had to. The cowboy's gaze narrowed. "And I'm supposed to believe that? Folks in town will say different. They'll say she found comfort here. They'll say you kept her." The accusation hung heavy. She felt her cheeks burn, though not from the cold. She wanted to deny it, to insist that nothing improper had happened, but even that truth seemed dangerous now. The longer she stood in this man's cabin, the less her words would matter. The mountain man didn't flinch. "Believe what you want. She'll speak for herself." Her breath caught. Both men turned toward her, their eyes demanding an answer. In that moment, she realized the terrible weight of choice had shifted fully onto her shoulders. No one could protect her from it. Not the promise made by her family, not the safety of the cabin walls, not even the mountain man's quiet strength. She would have to stand in the storm and decide which truth to claim before she could speak. The cowboy dismounted, his boots crunching on the snow. He took a step closer, his hand brushing against the reins at his side. "You're coming with me," he said firmly, his tone leaving no room for question. She froze, her heart pounding. The mountain man moved half a step forward, placing himself between her and the cowboy. The clearing grew heavy with silence, the kind that precedes a storm. She could see the tension in the cowboy's shoulders, the way his pride bristled at being challenged. She could feel the steadiness of the mountain man, unyielding as the pines behind him. And she stood caught between them, her whole life poised on the edge of this fragile moment. The cowboy's voice softened, though it carried the weight of command. "You know what's expected. Your family's waiting. The church is waiting. The town is waiting. You belong with me." Those words struck her harder than any shout. Belong, as though she were not her own. As though her worth existed only in the place he had chosen for her. She felt her hands tremble at her sides. But before she could gather her strength to answer, the mountain man spoke again, his voice calm but firm. "She'll go when she chooses, not when you demand it." The cowboy's eyes darkened, and for a moment she feared he might reach for the gun at his hip. The mountain man didn't move toward his knife, but his entire frame radiated readiness. Two different worlds stood before her, one shaped by order, rules, and expectation. The other by freedom, danger, and silence. And she knew whichever way this broke, there would be no turning back. The standoff stretched on until the wind shifted, carrying with it the creak of trees, heavy with ice. Finally, the cowboy turned his gaze back to her. "I'll be back in 2 days," he said flatly. "You'll be ready then. If you're not, folks will think the worst, and you'll have no place left among them." He mounted his horse, his movements sharp with anger, and rode off, the sound of hooves fading into the distance. She stood frozen in the doorway long after he vanished, her breath shallow, her chest tight. Inside, the mountain man went back to the fire, feeding it with a steady hand. He didn't speak. He didn't ask. Yet his silence was heavier than words, pressing her to confront the truth she had been running from. That night, she lay awake beneath the quilt, staring at the beams above her. 2 days, that was all she had to decide. 2 days to weigh the life she had always been told was hers against the life she had only just begun to taste. The choice felt impossible, but the longer she thought, the clearer one truth became. No matter what she chose, someone would be hurt. The next morning, the village stirred in her thoughts. She remembered her mother's hands kneading bread, her father's worn face as he worked the fields, the neighbors who smiled politely but spoke harshly behind closed doors. She thought of how quickly tongues would wag when word spread. A woman who turned her back on her promise was as good as an outcast. The shame would not fall on her. Alone it would stain her entire family. And yet, when she looked around the cabin, at the life built with resilience and quiet strength, she felt a longing she couldn't ignore. The mountain man never demanded, never cornered her with expectations. He simply lived, and in his presence. She felt her own heart begin to breathe in a way it never had before, but the cowboy's shadow loomed over every thought. He was not a man to let go easily. Pride could make a man dangerous, and his pride had been wounded before the entire town. She feared what he might do if she refused him. Would he spread lies? Would he come with others at his side, forcing her hand with threats she could not escape? The mountain man seemed to sense her unease. Later that day, as they worked side by side to chop wood, he finally spoke. "You don't owe me anything," he said quietly. "If you go back, I'll not stop you. If you stay, you'll have to live with what comes." She looked at him, searching his face for more, but that was all he gave. A choice laid bare, simple and cruel. Her heart ached with gratitude and fear all at once, as the sun dipped low. Casting the snow in shades of gold, she caught sight of movement along the ridge. A figure on horseback, watching from a distance. Her breath hitched. The cowboy hadn't waited. He was already keeping watch, measuring her steps, reminding her of the net closing around her. The sight of him sent a chill deeper than the cold. He would not rest until she was back under his control. And the worst part was knowing the village would side with him, not with her. The cowboy was their own, woven into their lives, while the mountain man was an outsider, a threat to their order. As night fell and the fire crackled inside the cabin, she realized that time was slipping faster than snow down a mountainside. 2 days had become less than one. The world she had left behind was already pressing in, and the man she feared was closer than ever. She closed her eyes, listening to the wind, to the steady sound of the mountain man sharpening his knife across the room, and to the pounding of her own heart. Suspense hung thick in the air, for the clash was no longer a question of if it was only a matter of when. The next morning broke with a hard stillness that seemed to hang over the mountain like a warning. The air was so sharp it burned her lungs when she stepped outside, the snow crunching beneath her boots with a brittle sound that carried too far in the silence. She stood there, her shawl pulled close, gazing at the endless sweep of white. It should have been beautiful, peaceful even, but all she could feel was the heavy weight of time pressing down. Each hour drew her closer to the moment when the cowboy would return, and with him the judgment of the world she had once belonged to. Inside the cabin, the mountain man moved with the same quiet rhythm he always had. He split logs with a steady swing of the axe, stacked them neatly, stoked the fire, prepared food in silence. It was almost as though nothing had changed, as though the storm had not lifted, and the outside world did not exist. But she knew he was aware of the rider who had watched from the ridge, aware of the danger creeping closer with each passing moment. He simply carried it differently, as he carried all things, tucked deep inside where it could not shake him. She envied that calm, yet it frightened her too, because she could feel her own heart unraveling under the strain. She tried to focus on small tasks, sweeping the floor, mending a tear in her skirt, stirring the pot of stew, and her hands trembled, and her thoughts wandered back to the man who believed he owned her. She knew his temper, not from violence, but from the sharpness in his words, the way he could cut down others when they failed to meet his expectations. If he could speak so harshly to men, what would he do when he believed she had shamed him? By afternoon, clouds gathered again, darkening the sky. A storm threatened, though whether of weather or of men, she could not tell. She caught the mountain man glancing toward the ridge more than once, his eyes narrowing slightly. At last, he set aside his axe and said quietly, "They won't wait. He'll come sooner than promised." Her breath caught. "How do you know?" He didn't look at her when he answered. Pride doesn't let a man sit still. He's already circling, waiting for the right moment. She felt a shiver run through her, one that no fire could warm. He was right. The cowboy would not let her slip further from his grasp. Every hour she remained on the mountain was an insult to his pride, and he would strike before the insult became permanent. As evening fell, the mountain man made preparations. He checked the rifle propped by the door, cleaned it with steady hands, then laid it aside without a word. He sharpened his knife again, though the blade was already honed to a fine edge. He worked as if he had done it all 1,000 times, with no hint of fear or hesitation. She watched him, torn between awe and dread. His calmness gave her strength, yet it also made the danger feel more real. That night, sleep would not come. She lay beneath the quilt, listening to every creak of the logs, every sigh of the wind against the cabin walls. Her mind replayed the cowboy's words, the way he had promised to return, the way his eyes had burned with anger. She thought of the town, of her family, of the church bell that tolled each Sunday. She thought of the life she was meant to live, neat and predictable, laid out like tracks in the snow. Then she thought of the mountain man, his steady silence, his strength, the way he had carried her from the storm as if she mattered more than anything. And she realized that no matter which way she turned, there would be no peace. Just before dawn, she heard the faint, distant sound of hooves. Not one horse this time, but several. Her heart leapt into her throat. She sat up quickly, clutching the quilt around her shoulders, her eyes wide in the dim glow of the dying fire. The mountain man was already awake. He rose from his chair, moving to the window without a sound. His expression did not change as he looked out into the gray light of morning, but his jaw tightened ever so slightly. She joined him at the window, her breath fogging the glass. Down the slope, she could just make out figures moving slowly through the snow. Riders, 3 of them. Their shapes dark against the pale drifts, their horses laboring through the cold. At their head rode the cowboy. Even from a distance, his posture was unmistakable, yigid, determined, unyielding. Her knees weakened. "He brought others," she whispered. The mountain man nodded once. "He wants to make a show of it." To prove he's right, she pressed a hand to her chest, feeling her heart hammer. The truth struck her hard. Then this was no longer about her alone. It was about pride, reputation, power. The cowboy had brought men with him not just to retrieve her, but to make certain the village knew the story as he wished it told. A woman rescued by a mountain man could be explained away. A woman who chose to stay with him could not. The riders drew closer, their shapes becoming clearer with each passing moment. The mountain man stepped back from the window, his movements slow and deliberate. "Stay inside," he said softly. "No matter what happens," her throat tightened. "You can't face them alone." His eyes met hers, steady and dark. "This isn't your fight." Not yet, but she knew it was. Every choice she had avoided, every silence she had clung to, had led to this moment. And now the fight was hers as much as his. The sound of hooves grew louder until it filled the clearing. Snow scattered as the riders came to a halt just beyond the cabin. The cowboy, sat tall in the saddle, his face grim, his jaw clenched tight. The two men beside him watched silently, their expressions unreadable. The mountain man opened the door and stepped outside, his frame filling the doorway like a wall. The cold air rushed in, carrying with it the tension of the moment. She stood just inside, her hands gripping the edge of the table, her body trembling. The cowboy spoke first, his voice carrying sharp in the morning air. "Time's up. She's coming with me." The mountain man stood firm, his voice calm but unyielding. "She makes her own choice." A flicker of anger passed across the cowboy's face. "You think the town will let this stand? You think her family will forgive? They'll say, 'You stole her.' They'll call her ruined." The words cut deep, but the mountain man did not flinch. "Let them say what they will. It doesn't change the truth." The cowboy's hand twitched near his gun, and the two men beside him shifted in their saddles. The air grew so tight she could scarcely breathe. Every sound, the creak of leather, the snort of a horse, the soft hiss of wind seemed to sharpen into something unbearable. She felt herself trembling harder, torn between fear and a surge of defiance. She wanted to cry out, to tell the cowboy she was not his to command, but her voice failed her. The weight of generations of expectation pressed down on her chest, choking her words. The mountain man did not move, but his presence was like stone, immovable, unbreakable. For a moment she thought the cowboy might turn back, might let the threat alone be enough. But then she saw the pride in his eyes. Burning brighter than reason, the standoff stretched on, the clearing holding its breath. Then the cowboy dismounted, snow crunching beneath his boots. His hand rested heavy on the gun at his hip, his eyes locked on the mountain man. She felt her heart stop. This was at the moment everything would break. The cowboy took another step forward. The mountain man's shoulders squared. The men on horseback shifted uneasily, their hands tightening on the reins. And then, silence. The kind of silence so deep it felt like the mountain itself was waiting, holding still to see which way the storm would fall. She pressed her hands together, her breath caught in her throat. The world seemed to shrink to this one clearing, this one moment, where pride and love and freedom all collided. She knew with chilling certainty that whatever happened next would decide everything. The cowboy's boots crunched across the snow, slow and deliberate, every step carrying the weight of his pride. His hand lingered near the pistol at his hip, and though he had not yet drawn it, the intent was clear in his posture. The two men behind him watched silently, their faces stiff with unease, as if they too understood how fragile the moment had become. The mountain man did not move. He stood like a rooted pine, his broad frame steady against the cold. His voice, when it came, was calm and even. "There's no need for blood. She'll speak, and her word will be final. No more threats. No more demands. Just her choice." For a moment, the cowboy's face hardened, his jaw tightening, as though he meant to refuse. He had spent his whole life believing his word was law, that what he wanted was already his by right. To be challenged, especially in front of others, was more than he could bear. His pride burned brighter than the snow glare around him, but behind that fire, she saw something else: fear. Fear of losing not just her, but the image he had built for himself in the town. The reputation he had polished like his boots. She stepped forward then, her heart hammering so hard it threatened to choke her. The cold stung her skin, but she hardly felt it. Every eye turned toward her, waiting, demanding, judging. She had been silent too long, letting others decide her path, letting fear guide her steps. But here, in this clearing on the edge of the wilderness, with both men poised for battle, she knew her silence would destroy them all. Her voice trembled at first, but it carried clear in the still air. "I am not something to be claimed. I am not a promise to be traded. I am not yours simply because it was arranged." The cowboy's face darkened, his mouth opening as though to cut her off, but she pressed on, stronger now. "You speak of the town, of my family, of what people will say, but you never asked what I wanted. You never saw me, only what I could be to you. That is not love. That is not a life." She turned then, meeting the mountain man's steady gaze. His eyes softened, though he said nothing. He didn't need to. His silence had always spoken more truth than 1,000 promises. The weight of her decision settled in her chest. Heavy but certain. "I will not go back with you," she told the cowboy, her voice firm now. "My choice is here, with him. With the life I choose for myself." For a long, terrible moment, no one moved. The only sound was the faint groan of the trees under the weight of snow. The cowboy stood frozen, her words cutting through the armor of his pride. His hand twitched near his pistol, but he did not draw it. Perhaps he saw the steadiness in the mountain man's stance, the unshakable resolve in his eyes. Perhaps he realized that if he pulled steel, this clearing would end in death, and the town would whisper of his ruin forever. The silence stretched until it seemed the mountain itself might split. Then slowly, the cowboy lowered his hand. His shoulders sagged, not in surrender but in bitter recognition. He had lost not to the mountain man, but to her. His eyes burned as he looked at her one last time. "You'll regret this," he said, his voice low, cold, carrying the sting of wounded pride. "The town will turn its back. Don't expect me to defend you when they do." He turned sharply, swinging into the saddle with practiced ease. The two men beside him shifted, uncertainty flickering in their eyes, but they followed without a word. Within moments, the sound of hooves echoed away into the distance. Leaving only the hush of the snow and the beating of her heart, she stood frozen, breathless, as the clearing emptied. The mountain man stepped toward her then, placing a steady hand on her shoulder. "It's done," he said simply. Her knees weakened, and she let herself lean into him, the weight of days and nights of fear finally breaking loose. Tears stung her eyes, though they were not of regret but of release. For the first time, she felt her life was her own, shaped not by duty or expectation, but by choice. The days that followed were not easy. Word traveled fast down in the village. She heard later from a passing trapper that tongues wagged in the store, in the church, at the wells. Some called her foolish, others called her ruined, and some whispered that she had been bewitched by the mountain man. The cowboy's pride was too great to let him stay silent. He painted himself the victim, telling anyone who would listen that she had betrayed him, yet none of it reached her cabin on the ridge. The mountains stood tall around her, shielding her from the clamor below. She found peace in the rhythm of life. She had only begun to learn the steady work of chopping wood, mending clothes, tending to the fire. Each small act grounded her, reminding her that freedom was not only a word, but a labor. Earned and kept each day, the mountain man never pressed her with questions or promises. He lived as he always had, steady, reliable, his presence, a quiet shelter. Yet in his silence she found something deeper than words. He had given her the gift of choice, and choosing him, she discovered her own strength. As winter gave way to spring, the world softened. Snow melted into rushing streams, and green began to creep across the slopes. She walked with him into the woods, learning the trails, learning the calls of birds, the signs of animals. Each day brought new lessons, and with them a growing sense of belonging, not because someone had placed her there, but because she had claimed it. From time to time, she thought of the village, of the family she had left behind, of the friends who no longer spoke her name. The ache of that loss would never vanish entirely. But she also knew that to return would have been to lose herself, to become a shadow of the woman she was meant to be. Out here in the raw silence of the wilderness, she was no longer just a daughter or a bride-to-be. She was herself, wholly and fiercely, and that was worth every sacrifice. The mountain man said little of the future, but she began to see it in the way he left space for her, in the way he taught her the skills of survival, as though preparing her to stand beside him, not behind him. She saw it in the quiet glances he gave when he thought she wasn't looking, the rare curve of a smile that broke his rugged stillness. He was not a man of grand declarations, but his every act spoke the truth. She was not a passing guest. She was home. One evening, as the sun dipped behind the peaks, painting the snow in gold and rose, she stood outside the cabin with him at her side. The air was crisp, carrying the scent of pine and earth waking after the long freeze. She looked out across the valley, vast and untamed, felt a swell of gratitude rise in her chest. "I used to think my life was already written," she said softly, "that my choices were made for me before I even spoke them aloud." She turned to him, her voice steadier. "But now I know different. I know I can choose. And I've chosen this. I've chosen you." For a long moment he only looked at her, his eyes reflecting the fire of the fading sun. Then he nodded once, a simple gesture, but one that carried more weight than any vow. The world below would go on whispering, forever caught in its own judgments and expectations. But up here, on the mountain, she had found something stronger than approval or reputation. She had found freedom, love, and the strength to live a life of her own making. And as the wind moved gently through the trees, carrying with it the promise of seasons yet to come, she knew without doubt that she had made the right choice. She was not meant for the cowboy, nor for the safe path the village had laid before her. She was meant for this life, for this wilderness, for this man who had taken her in from the storm and made her his forever. The mountain, silent and eternal, bore witness to it all, and in its shadow she found peace.